Carl Jung. The universe delays love until you're ready to receive it fully. There's a psychological truth so dangerous, so contrary to everything you've been taught about love, that it's been hidden in the footnotes of Carl Jung's work for nearly a century. And once you understand it, you'll never look at your romantic history the same way again. Every person you couldn't keep, every relationship that fell apart at the exact moment it should have deepened, every time you felt ready for love but found yourself alone instead, none of it was random, none of it was punishment, and none of it was about you being unworthy. The universe was protecting you from the most catastrophic psychological event that can happen to an unprepared human being, receiving love before you're whole enough to hold it. Jung discovered something that makes most people deeply uncomfortable. He found that premature love, love that arrives before you've completed certain critical stages of psychological development, doesn't save you. It destroys you. It dismantles your identity, arrests your growth, and turns two incomplete people into a shared madness that neither can escape. Think about that for a moment. We've been taught that love is always good, always healing, always the answer. But Jung saw something else in his decades of clinical work. He watched brilliant people enter relationships and vanish. He observed how two individuals could merge so completely that both ceased to exist as separate beings. He witnessed partnerships that looked like love from the outside but were actually mutual possession. Two people trapped in each other's unconscious complexes, playing out scripts written in childhood, destroying each other with the best intentions. This is the forbidden knowledge. Love is not a beginner's game. It's the ultimate test of psychological maturity. And the universe, or your own deep psyche, which amounts to the same thing, will delay love, sabotage relationships, and keep you alone until you've built the internal architecture strong enough to sustain intimacy without collapsing into it. You're not being punished with solitude. You're being prepared for something your current structure can't survive. Let me show you what I mean. Think about the last relationship that didn't work out. The one where you thought, this is it. Where everything felt right. Where you could see the future clearly. Now think about who you were then. Think about the unhealed wounds you were carrying. The parts of yourself you hadn't yet acknowledged. The emotional patterns you didn't understand. What would have happened if that relationship had lasted? Would you have grown? Or would you have stayed frozen in that undeveloped state, using the relationship as a way to avoid the painful inner work that only solitude can force upon you? Jung knew something that terrifies most people. We don't enter relationships to grow. We enter them to hide. We use love as an escape from self-confrontation. We find someone who will let us remain unconscious just a little while longer, and the universe, in its wisdom, recognizes this and intervenes. Every failed relationship is actually a successful protection. Every wrong timing is actually perfect timing. Every moment of loneliness is actually a gift, space for the transformation that must happen before you're ready to meet another whole human being without devouring them or being devoured. But here's what makes this knowledge dangerous. Once you understand it, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to blaming others for your romantic failures. You can't keep telling yourself that you just haven't met the right person. You have to face the terrifying possibility that you haven't become the right person yet, that the work required of you isn't out there in the dating pool. It's in here, in the unexplored territories of your own psyche. Jung called this process individuation, the long, painful journey of becoming a whole person, of integrating all the parts of yourself you've rejected, of developing a self strong enough to engage in relationship without losing itself in the process. And he believed that this journey was prerequisite to real love, not because you need to be perfect to deserve love, but because you need to be whole enough to receive it without destroying it. Most people spend their entire lives seeking love while simultaneously running from the inner work that would make them capable of sustaining it. They jump from relationship to relationship, always convinced the next person will be different, never realizing that they bring the same undeveloped psyche to every encounter. They wonder why their relationships keep failing in the same ways, why they keep attracting the same type of person, why intimacy always transforms into chaos. The answer is simple but brutal. They're not ready, and the universe knows it, even when they don't. This isn't a moral judgment. It's not about being good enough or worthy enough. It's about psychological architecture. It's about whether your inner temple has a foundation solid enough to hold the earthquake of true intimacy. It's about whether you've done the work of meeting yourself before you try to meet another. And here's the secret that changes everything. The delay you're experiencing isn't a denial, it's an invitation. The loneliness you're feeling isn't emptiness, it's space being created for the transformation that must occur. The universe isn't keeping love from you, it's keeping you in the crucible long enough for you to become someone who can actually receive love without using it as an escape, a validation, or a completion of your incomplete self. Over the next hour, we're going to explore exactly what Jung meant by readiness. We're going to look at the psychological stages you must move through before you're capable of conscious relationship. We're going to examine the shadow work, the Anima and Animus integration, the parent complex resolution, and the self-development that constitute real preparation for intimacy. But more than that, we're going to look at what happens when you skip these stages. We're going to explore the catastrophic consequences of premature love, the identity annihilation, the projection traps, the arrested individuation, and what Jung called soul loss, that state of being so absorbed into another person that you lose connection to your own destiny. This is not comfortable material. Jung never promised comfort, he promised truth. And the truth is that most people's understanding of love is actually a sophisticated defense against the real thing. Most people's romantic history is a story of running toward projection and running away from presence. Most people have never actually experienced love. They've experienced the collision of two sets of unconscious complexes, mistaking psychological possession for spiritual union. But there's hope in this darkness, because once you understand the real reason for the delay, once you see that your solitude has been sacred preparation rather than cosmic punishment, you can stop resisting it. You can stop frantically seeking love as an escape and start doing the actual work that makes you ready. You can transform your loneliness from a problem to be solved into a chrysalis, where the person you need to become is being born. The universe delays love until you're ready to receive it fully, not because it's cruel, but because it knows what you can't yet see. That unready love is one of the most dangerous psychological events that can happen to a human being, and it's protecting you from the version of love that would destroy you, holding space for the version that will transform you instead. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But here's what he didn't say explicitly, what he left hidden in his clinical observations. If those two substances aren't stable enough in themselves, the reaction doesn't create something new. It creates an explosion that obliterates both. You're not waiting for love. You're being forged into someone who can survive the meeting when it comes. And everything that's happened to you, every heartbreak, every rejection, every moment of crushing loneliness has been part of that forging process. The question isn't when will love arrive? The question is, what work am I being called to do in the waiting? Because the waiting isn't empty time, it's full time, pregnant time, time when your psyche is reorganizing itself at the deepest levels, preparing you for an encounter that would have destroyed the person you used to be. This is your initiation, not into love, but into the kind of wholeness that makes love possible. Not into finding someone who completes you, but into becoming complete enough that you can meet another complete person and create something that enhances both of your journeys rather than derailing them. Are you ready to understand what you're really being prepared for? Are you ready to see your romantic history not as a series of failures, but as a carefully orchestrated protection system? Are you ready to discover what Jung knew that almost no one talks about, that the universe's delay is actually the universe's deepest compassion? Then stay with me, because what we're about to explore will change not just how you think about love, but how you think about yourself, your past, and the transformation that's happening right now, in this very moment, whether you're aware of it or not. The universe delays love until you're ready to receive it fully. Let's discover what that readiness actually requires. In his clinical practice spanning 5 decades, Carl Jung observed a psychological pattern so common, so destructive, and so invisible to those experiencing it, that he considered it one of the primary sources of human suffering in the modern world. He never gave it a formal name. Jung wasn't fond of rigid diagnostic categories, but his case notes describe it with devastating clarity. I call it the Unready Heart Syndrome. And if you've ever wondered why your relationships follow the same painful patterns, why you attract people who seem perfect at first but become impossible later, why intimacy feels simultaneously like the thing you crave most and fear most, you need to understand this condition, because you might be living it right now without knowing it. The Unready Heart Syndrome is this: seeking union while lacking inner wholeness, which inevitably leads to compulsive relationship patterns, projection addiction, and the use of romance as an escape from self-confrontation rather than an expression of self-sharing. Let me break that down, because every word matters. When Jung talked about seeking union, he wasn't just talking about wanting a relationship. He was talking about that desperate, almost frantic quality that underlies much of modern romance. The sense that you need someone else to feel complete, that your life can't really begin until you find your person, that being alone is a problem to be solved rather than a state to be mastered. This isn't desire, it's compulsion. And compulsion always indicates something unconscious at work. The person with an unready heart enters the dating world like someone crawling through a desert towards what they think is water. They're not looking for connection. They're looking for rescue. They're not seeking to share their life. They're seeking someone to give their life meaning. And this distinction, this subtle but crucial difference, determines everything that follows. Here's what Jung observed. The unready heart doesn't actually want a relationship. It wants an escape. It wants someone to make the loneliness go away, someone to quiet the inner voices, someone to distract from the painful work of self-examination. It wants merger, fusion, completion through another. And this wanting, no matter how sincere it feels, is actually a sophisticated avoidance of the one thing that would actually heal the loneliness: meeting yourself. Think about your own experience. Have you ever noticed that the most intense periods of seeking love often coincide with the most intense periods of avoiding something in yourself? That the times you most desperately wanted a relationship were often the times when you were running from depression, anxiety, emptiness, or a nagging sense that something was wrong with your life. This isn't coincidence. The unready heart uses romantic seeking as a defense mechanism against self-confrontation. If you're busy looking for your soulmate, you don't have to ask why you feel so disconnected from yourself. If you're focused on finding someone to complete you, you don't have to examine why you feel incomplete. If you're consumed with dating apps and romantic possibilities, you don't have to sit with the uncomfortable silence of your own company. Jung saw this pattern repeat endlessly in his practice. Patients would come to him complaining about their inability to find lasting love, and through analysis, he would discover that their entire romantic life was structured around avoidance. They weren't moving toward intimacy, they were running from themselves. And here's where it gets really insidious. The Unready Heart Syndrome doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like readiness. It feels like you're finally open to love, finally willing to be vulnerable, finally putting yourself out there. The person experiencing it would swear they want real connection, genuine intimacy, lasting partnership, and they mean it. But wanting isn't the same as being ready, and the gap between those two states is where most modern relationships go to die. Let me describe the symptoms. See if you recognize yourself in any of these patterns. Symptom 1. The serial almost right pattern. You keep meeting people who seem perfect at first. The chemistry is intense. The connection feels real. You can see a future together, but then always within a specific time frame, 3 months, 6 months, a year, something shifts. The person who seems so right suddenly reveals deal breakers. The relationship that felt so promising starts feeling suffocating. You find yourself looking for the exit, or they do. And here's the key. It's not that you're choosing wrong. It's that you're unconsciously choosing people who are perfect for keeping you in the pattern. People who are unavailable enough that you never have to face real intimacy. People who are available enough that you can convince yourself you're trying. People who mirror your own unreadiness so perfectly that the relationship becomes a closed system. Two people acting out their psychological wounds without ever actually seeing each other. Jung would look at this pattern and ask, what are you protecting yourself from? What would happen if someone actually stayed, actually saw you completely, actually asked you to show up fully? Symptom 2. The mirror attraction. This is one of Jung's most powerful insights, and most people miss it completely. You don't attract wrong people. You attract perfect mirrors of your unhealed wounds. The person who abandons you is reflecting your own self-abandonment. The person who can't commit is reflecting your own terror of being trapped. The person who's emotionally unavailable is reflecting the parts of yourself you've made unavailable to your own awareness. This is projection in its purest form. You're encountering your own psyche in the other person, but you can't see it. You think they're the problem. You think if you could just find someone different, someone healthier, someone more evolved, then the relationship would work. But Jung discovered something that will save you years of repetitive suffering. Until you heal the wound you're projecting, you'll keep attracting people who embody it. The universe isn't sending you the wrong people. It's sending you mirrors of your own unconscious material, giving you chance after chance to see yourself clearly and do the work that only you can do. The woman who keeps attracting emotionally distant men isn't unlucky. She's being shown her own emotional distance, her own defended heart, her own fear of being vulnerable. The man who keeps attracting women who want to change him isn't a victim of controlling partners. He's being shown his own disconnection from his authentic self, his own pattern of performing for love rather than offering his truth. The Unready Heart Syndrome creates perfect mirror relationships, and most people spend their whole lives angry at the mirrors instead of looking at what the mirrors are reflecting. Symptom 3. The intimacy abandonment terror. Here's where the syndrome reveals its deepest contradiction. You're simultaneously terrified of intimacy and terrified of abandonment. You want someone to get close, but when they do, you panic. You want someone to stay, but when they commit, you feel trapped. You crave connection, but when it's offered, you doubt it, test it, sabotage it. This isn't irrationality. This is the unready heart trying to protect itself from exposure, because real intimacy means being seen. And if you haven't done the work of seeing yourself first, of acknowledging your shadow, integrating your projections, healing your wounds, then being seen by another feels like annihilation. Jung noticed that many of his patients would unconsciously engineer their relationships to maintain a specific distance, close enough to not be alone, far enough to not be truly known. They would pick partners who couldn't give them what they claimed to want, then complain about not getting it, never realizing that the not getting it was the entire point. Because actually getting it would force them into the vulnerability they're not ready to experience. This creates the classic push-pull dynamic. You pursue someone who's distant. When they finally come closer, you become distant. They pursue you. You run. They stop pursuing. You pursue again. Back and forth, an endless dance where both people are ensuring that real intimacy never actually happens. And the cruelest part? You genuinely believe you want the thing you're avoiding. The unready heart has convinced itself that it's seeking love, while its entire behavioral pattern is designed to prevent love from actually landing. Symptom 4. The unconscious sabotage. This is where the syndrome becomes almost invisible, even to therapists who aren't trained to see it. You don't consciously ruin your relationships. You just make certain choices. You just respond in certain ways. You just happen to get sick when a commitment conversation is planned, or busy when vulnerability is being offered, or critical when your partner is being tender. Jung called these symptomatic actions, behaviors that look random but are actually unconscious, purposeful. Your psyche knows you're not ready, even when your ego desperately wants love. And your psyche, being wiser and more protective than your ego, will sabotage anything that threatens to force intimacy before you've built the inner structure to handle it. You pick a fight right when things are going well. You suddenly notice all your partner's flaws right when they're showing up most fully. You create drama, distance, tests, not because you're damaged or bad at relationships, but because your unconscious is trying to protect you from what it knows you can't yet survive, being truly known while you're still a stranger to yourself. Here's what most people miss. Your sabotage patterns are intelligent. They're your psyche's immune system responding to a threat. And the threat isn't the other person. The threat is premature vulnerability, exposure before you're integrated, intimacy before you're individuated. Symptom 5. The relationship as identity. The final symptom is perhaps the most revealing. When you're in a relationship, you disappear. Your interests become their interests. Your opinions shift to match theirs. Your entire identity reorganizes around the partnership. You might think this is healthy compromise or deep love, but Jung would see it as something much darker. Identity diffusion, the loss of self, psychological merger that destroys both individuals. The unready heart doesn't enter relationships. It abandons itself into them. It uses the other person as a replacement for the self it hasn't developed. And this feels like love, feels like profound connection until it doesn't. Until you wake up one day not recognizing yourself. Until you realize you've become a supporting character in someone else's story while your own story has stopped being written. This is the core of the Unready Heart Syndrome. You're seeking externally what can only be found internally. You're trying to use another person to do the work that only solitude, self-examination, and psychological integration can do. You're attempting to shortcut individuation through romance, and it never works. It can't work, because wholeness isn't created through union. Wholeness is the prerequisite for healthy union. Now, here's where Jung's insight becomes truly radical, where it challenges everything our culture teaches us about love and readiness. Modern culture has pathologized solitude. We're told that being alone means something is wrong with us, that we should always be seeking partnership, that a single person is somehow incomplete. The entire therapeutic establishment often operates under the assumption that the goal is to get into a healthy relationship. as if relationship itself is the mark of psychological health. But Jung saw it exactly opposite. He observed that the people most desperate for relationships were often the least ready for them, that the ability to be genuinely alone, not lonely but alone, was a prerequisite for the ability to be genuinely intimate. That solitude wasn't a problem to be solved, but a crucible where the self is forged. He watched patients rush from relationship to relationship, always convinced the next one would work, never realizing they were bringing the same undeveloped psyche to every encounter. He noticed how culture pressured people into partnerships before they'd completed essential developmental stages, essentially weaponizing readiness, making people feel defective for not being coupled, shaming them into relationships they weren't prepared for. And he saw the carnage this created. Two unready people meeting doesn't create readiness. It creates a shared system of avoidance, a mutual protection racket where both parties unconsciously agree to keep each other unconscious. They become invested in not growing because growth would threaten the relationship they've built on their mutual unreadiness. Here's the paradox that Jung identified. The more desperately you seek love, the more the universe delays it, not as punishment but as protection, because desperation itself is proof of unreadiness. Desperation means you're seeking completion through another, and seeking completion through another means you haven't yet discovered your own completeness. This is why your relationships keep failing in the same ways. Not because you're choosing wrong, but because you're bringing the same level of unreadiness to every choice. Not because love is hard, but because you're attempting love before you've done the prerequisite work that makes love possible. The Unready Heart Syndrome isn't about deserving love or being worthy of partnership. You already deserve love. Your worthiness was never in question. This is about psychological architecture. It's about whether your inner temple has a foundation solid enough to hold the earthquake of real intimacy. It's about whether you've developed a self, Jung's term for the central organizing principle of the psyche, that's coherent enough to meet another self without either dissolving into merger or fortifying into defense. And here's the really uncomfortable truth. Most people haven't. Most people are walking around with a loose collection of unintegrated complexes, unprocessed wounds, and borrowed identities, mistaking this fragmentation for a self and wondering why their relationships keep falling apart. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what he observed in his practice was that most meetings weren't between two personalities. They were between two collections of defense mechanisms, two sets of projections, two unconscious complexes finding each other and creating a third complex, the relationship itself, that possessed both parties. This is what happens when unready hearts meet. Not love, not transformation, but mutual possession. Two people trapped in each other's unconscious material, unable to see each other for who they actually are, acting out scripts written in childhood, creating a psychological prison they call intimacy. And the universe, your own deep psyche, yourself, whatever you want to call it, recognizes this danger. It sees that you're about to enter a dynamic that will arrest your development, that will turn intimacy into a defense against growth rather than a catalyst for it. And it intervenes. It delays. It denies. It keeps you alone until you finally stop running and turn to face the only person you've been avoiding, yourself. If you're experiencing the Unready Heart Syndrome right now, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, know that your loneliness isn't punishment. It's intervention. The universe isn't being cruel. It's being surgical, protecting you from the version of love that would destroy you while you develop the capacity for the version of love that will transform you. But that transformation requires something from you. It requires that you stop seeing solitude as a problem and start seeing it as sacred preparation. It requires that you stop frantically seeking external union and start doing the internal integration that makes union possible. It requires that you face what you've been avoiding, the shadow parts of yourself you've been projecting onto partners, the childhood wounds you've been trying to heal through adult relationships, the emptiness you've been trying to fill with another person's presence. The Unready Heart Syndrome isn't a life sentence. It's a diagnosis, and diagnosis is the first step toward cure. But the cure isn't finding the right person. The cure is becoming the right person, whole enough, conscious enough, individuated enough that when love arrives, you're ready to receive it without destroying it or being destroyed by it. Jung observed this transformation countless times. He watched patients move from compulsive relationship seeking to genuine readiness, from desperate merger to conscious connection, from using others as escape to offering themselves as gift. But it never happened quickly, and it never happened without pain, because becoming ready for love requires you to face everything you've been using relationships to avoid. It requires you to sit with the loneliness you've been running from, to examine the wounds you've been projecting, to integrate the shadow material you've been seeing in partners instead of in yourself. It requires you to die to who you've been and be reborn as who you're meant to become. And the universe won't let you skip this death. It will keep love at bay, keep you in the crucible, keep you alone in the dark until the transformation is complete enough that intimacy becomes enhancement rather than replacement, sharing rather than seeking, recognition rather than rescue. This is the Unready Heart Syndrome. This is the hidden condition affecting millions of people who wonder why love keeps eluding them. This is the pattern you must recognize before you can break it. And the breaking begins with a single question. What if my readiness isn't about finding someone worthy of me, but about becoming someone worthy of the love I claim I want? What if the work isn't out there? What if it's in here, in the unexplored territories of your own psyche, waiting for you to finally stop running and start excavating? The universe delays love until you're ready to receive it fully. Now you know why. The question is, are you ready to do what readiness actually requires? Let me introduce you to someone. We'll call her Anna, though that's not her real name. Jung never used real names in his published work, respecting the sacred confidentiality of the analytic relationship, but her case appears thinly veiled in several of his private papers and correspondence with other analysts. And it's one of the most profound examples of the Unready Heart Syndrome I've ever encountered. Anna came to Jung's practice in 1925. She was 34 years old, which in that era was considered tragically late to be unmarried. Successful in her career as a translator, cultured, intelligent, and by all accounts, quite beautiful. Men pursued her constantly. She received proposals. She had opportunities most women of her time would have envied, and she was profoundly, mysteriously alone. Not because she wanted to be. Anna desperately wanted partnership. She spoke about marriage with an urgency that bordered on panic, as if her life couldn't truly begin until she found someone. Her friends didn't understand it. Her family had given up trying to explain it. Here was a woman with everything supposedly necessary for love, yet love never landed. It circled, approached, got close, then inevitably flew away. Or, more accurately, she pushed it away, though she couldn't see how she was doing it. Jung's intake notes describe her relationship history in devastating detail, a pattern so consistent it was almost mathematical. She would meet someone. The chemistry would be intense, immediate. She would throw herself into the connection with complete abandon. For 3 months, maybe 4, it would be intoxicating. She would already be planning the wedding, imagining the children, designing the life they'd build together. Then something would shift. The man who seemed perfect would reveal some flaw, a habit, a preference, a quality that suddenly became intolerable to her. Or he would become too available, too eager, too clearly devoted. And Anna would feel a rising panic, a claustrophobic sense of being trapped, smothered. She would become critical, distant, cold. She would pick fights over nothing. She would test his devotion with impossible demands. And when he inevitably pulled away, exhausted, confused, hurt, she would feel vindicated. See, he was just like all the others, unable to handle her, incapable of meeting her needs. Another unavailable man. Then the cycle would begin again. She would mourn the loss, convince herself she'd learned something, vow to choose differently next time, and she would choose the exact same type of man, wearing a different face. By the time she arrived at Jung's door, she had been through this pattern with 18 different men. 18 times she had been absolutely certain this was the one. 18 times the relationship had collapsed in the exact same way, at the exact same stage, with her feeling the exact same combination of relief and devastation. "I think I'm cursed," she told Jung in their first session. "I think I'm meant to be alone. There must be something wrong with me that men can sense, some defect that makes me unlovable." But Jung, with his characteristic perception, saw something else immediately. Anna wasn't cursed. She was unconscious, and her unconsciousness was running her life with perfect, devastating precision. He began where he always began, with dreams. Anna's dreams were vivid, recurring, full of symbolic material that her conscious mind completely missed, but her unconscious was desperately trying to communicate. In one dream that appeared frequently, she was in her childhood home, searching for her father. She knew he was somewhere in the house, but she couldn't find him. Every room she entered was empty. She would call out for him, increasingly frantic, but he never answered. And then she would realize she was locked inside, and he was outside somewhere, and she was completely alone in this empty house that should have been home, but felt like a prison. To Anna, this was just a nightmare, a rehashing of childhood loneliness. Her father had been a diplomat, frequently absent, emotionally distant even when present, sad, certainly. But what did it have to do with her inability to sustain a relationship as an adult? Everything, Jung explained. Everything. He introduced her to one of his most powerful concepts, the father complex. This isn't just having an absent or difficult father. A complex is an autonomous psychic constellation, a cluster of emotionally charged ideas, images, and experiences that function like a separate personality within the psyche. When a complex is active, it literally possesses you, running your behavior without your conscious awareness or consent. Anna's father complex was running her entire romantic life. Here's how Jung helped her see it. Her father had been emotionally unavailable but periodically present. He would disappear for months on diplomatic assignments, and young Anna would feel abandoned, unimportant, forgotten. Then he would return, and for a brief window, maybe a week or two, he would be attentive, bringing gifts, telling stories, making her feel like the most special girl in the world. Then he would become distant again, even while physically present, retreating into his work, his own concerns, and Anna would work desperately to get his attention back, performing, achieving, being perfect, being whatever she thought might make him look at her again. This pattern imprinted on her psyche like a groove in soft wax, and 40 years later she was still following it. Jung showed her how she unconsciously sought out men who replicated this dynamic. Men who were emotionally unavailable in some way, married to their work, still healing from past relationships, commitment-phobic, geographically distant. She wasn't attracted to healthy, available men. She was attracted to men who felt like father, close enough to offer hope, distant enough to maintain the familiar ache of longing. And when, by accident, she met a man who was actually available, actually ready for commitment, actually capable of sustained presence, her father complex couldn't recognize him. He didn't feel like love because he didn't feel like the pattern. So her psyche manufactured reasons to reject him, creating artificial distance to recreate the familiar dynamic. But here's where it gets even deeper, where Jung's analysis reveals the true architecture of Anna's unreadiness. It wasn't just that she was attracted to unavailable men. She was terrified of available ones, because an available man would actually see her, would know her, would stay long enough to witness not just the performer she'd become to earn her father's attention, but the authentic self she'd buried beneath that performance. And that authentic self, the one that felt abandoned, unworthy, not special enough to make fathers stay, that self was still there, unhealed, hidden, desperate to remain hidden. What would happen, Jung asked her in one session, if a man truly loved you, if he stayed, if he was present, if he offered himself completely? Anna's face went pale. Her hands started trembling. "I don't know," she whispered. "I can't imagine it." "Can't imagine it," Jung pressed, "or are terrified to imagine it." And then it came out, the truth she'd been avoiding. If he really saw me, he would leave, just like father left, because there's something fundamentally unlovable about me. The performance is all I have. If he got past the performance to the real me, he would find nothing, emptiness, the reason father couldn't stay. This is what Jung meant by the father complex. Anna had internalized her father's emotional absence as evidence of her own unworthiness. She had created a psychic equation, real me, abandonment. Therefore, any man who got close to the real me would inevitably abandon her. So her entire personality had organized around avoiding this exposure. She performed, she dazzled. She gave men the entertaining, charming, perfect Anna. And the moment anyone threatened to see beneath that performance, her panic system activated, and she engineered the very abandonment she feared. But on her terms, with her narrative intact. He was unavailable. He couldn't handle her. He left because he was broken, not because she was. It's a brilliant defensive system, really. Tragic, but brilliant. She maintained psychological safety by ensuring she was only ever rejected for the performance, never for the authentic self that she believed was unlovable. But Jung saw what Anna couldn't. The authentic self wasn't empty, wasn't unlovable, wasn't the problem. The problem was that she'd never met her authentic self. She'd been performing for so long she had no idea who existed beneath the performance. And this is the core of the Unready Heart Syndrome. You can't receive love for a self you haven't discovered yet. You can't let someone see you if you've never seen yourself. You can't risk intimacy when you're still a stranger to your own authentic being. Anna's relationships kept failing, not because the men were wrong, but because she was attempting intimacy before she had a self to be intimate with. She was trying to share something she hadn't found, trying to give access to territory she'd never explored. Jung's work with Anna took a radical turn. He stopped focusing on her relationships entirely. Instead, he began the long, painful process of helping her meet herself. He had her work with her dreams, dialoguing with the images and figures that appeared. The empty house in her recurring dream, he explained, wasn't a metaphor for her childhood home. It was a metaphor for her own psyche, empty because she'd abandoned it, because she'd been so busy performing for external validation that no one was home inside. He introduced her to the concept of the shadow, all the qualities she'd rejected in herself because they didn't fit the performance. Her anger at her father's abandonment, her neediness, her vulnerability, her sexual desire, her ambition, all the parts of herself she deemed unacceptable and pushed into the unconscious. And here's the thing about the shadow. What you don't acknowledge in yourself, you project onto others. Anna had been projecting her own unavailability onto her partners. She was the one who couldn't truly be present, who couldn't offer her authentic self, who was always holding back the real Anna. But she couldn't see it. She saw it in them instead, their emotional distance, their inability to commit, their failure to truly meet her. Jung had her do what he called active imagination, a practice where she would dialogue with these shadow parts in writing, giving them voice, allowing them to speak their truths. And what emerged was devastating. Her anger spoke. I hate him. I hate Father for leaving. I hate every man who reminds me of him. I hate myself for still wanting him to come back. Her neediness spoke. I'm so tired of pretending I don't need anyone. I'm so tired of being strong and independent and fine. I want someone to stay. I want someone to choose me. I want to matter enough that someone doesn't leave. Her authentic self, the one she'd buried, spoke last. I've been here the whole time. You've been avoiding me because you think I'm not enough. But I am enough. I always have been. You're the one who left me, not Father. You abandoned me to become someone you thought would be lovable, and now you're alone, not because of Father, but because you chose performance over presence. You chose safety over self. Anna wept when she wrote that last part. Deep, body-shaking sobs that she said felt like they'd been waiting 30 years to be released. I'm the one who left, she told Jung. I'm the one who wasn't present. I've been blaming men for abandoning me, but I abandoned myself first. This was the turning point. Not a happy turning point. Jung never promised happiness, only consciousness. But the moment when real work could begin. Jung introduced her to another crucial concept, the Animus. This is the unconscious masculine principle within a woman's psyche. The inner masculine, the part of her that carries qualities of assertion, independence, logos, spirit. When the Animus isn't consciously developed, women project it onto external men, demanding that partners embody these qualities for them. Anna hadn't developed her own inner masculine. She had projected it entirely onto her father first, then onto the men she dated. She needed them to provide strength, direction, purpose, validation. She needed them to make her feel valuable, chosen, special. She was seeking her missing animus in external men rather than developing it within herself. This is why you attract father figures, Jung explained. You're not seeking a partner, you're seeking the father who would finally stay. You're seeking the masculine presence you never developed in yourself. And no man can carry that projection successfully. It's too heavy, too total. He will inevitably fail to live up to the impossible standard because you're not asking him to be himself. You're asking him to be your unintegrated animus. The work became focused on animus integration. Jung had Anna examine what qualities she was demanding men provide. Stability. She needed to develop her own inner stability. Direction. She needed to connect with her own sense of purpose. Validation. She needed to learn to validate herself. This wasn't about becoming masculine or independent in a way that rejected relationship. It was about becoming whole enough that she could enter relationship as a complete person rather than seeking a man to complete her. The process took time, not weeks or months, but years. Anna entered what Jung called the nigredo, the blackening, the dark night of the soul, the alchemical stage where everything you thought you were dissolves. She stopped dating entirely, not because Jung told her to, but because she realized she needed to be alone. Really alone. Not the performative solitude where you're constantly checking your phone for messages. Not the provisional aloneness where you're always half looking for the next person, but genuine solitude, sacred solitude. She took up practices Jung recommended, long walks where she practiced being present in her own company, journaling where she dialogued with her shadow, her animus, the child self that still believed she was unlovable. Dream work where she learned to read the symbolic language her unconscious was speaking. And slowly, painfully slowly, something shifted. About 18 months into the work, Anna had a different dream. She was in a house again, but this time it wasn't empty. She walked through the rooms and found various versions of herself. The performing Anna who had charmed everyone, the angry Anna who had never been allowed expression, the needy Anna who had been shamed into silence, the authentic Anna who had been buried. In the dream, these versions didn't fight. They sat together. They looked at each other with something like compassion, and then they began to merge, to integrate, becoming one coherent person who contained all these parts, without being dominated by any single one. She woke from that dream feeling different. "I don't know how to describe it," she told Jung, "but I feel here, present, like I've been a ghost haunting my own life, and suddenly I have substance." Jung recognized this as a crucial marker, the beginning of self-emergence. The self, in Jungian psychology, isn't just your personality or ego, it's the central organizing principle of the psyche, the archetype of wholeness that coordinates all the other parts into a coherent unity. Anna was beginning to develop a self, and with a self came something she'd never experienced before, genuine choice. Not the compulsive choices driven by her father complex, but conscious choice emerging from a center that was truly hers. She noticed changes immediately. She stopped frantically checking dating apps, stopped analyzing every interaction with men for signs of rejection or validation, stopped feeling that desperate, clawing urgency about finding someone. "I thought I would feel lonely," she told Jung, "but I don't. I feel full, like my own company is enough. Not in a self-sufficient way where I don't need anyone, but in a way where I'm genuinely okay whether someone comes or not. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm living." Jung warned her about a common pitfall at this stage: spiritual bypassing, using psychological work as a new form of avoidance. Some people become so comfortable with their individuation process that they start avoiding relationship altogether, convinced they're beyond needing connection or that no one is conscious enough for them. But Anna didn't fall into that trap. She remained open to relationship, just not desperate for it. There's a crucial difference Jung identified: openness without need, availability without urgency. She continued her work. Shadow integration was ongoing. Jung always said individuation is a lifelong process, never complete. But she reached what he called a critical threshold, a level of psychological development where her identity was solid enough that another person would enhance rather than define her. And then, about 2 years into her work with Jung, something unexpected happened. She met someone. But the meeting felt completely different from her previous experiences. His name was Michael. He was a colleague, someone who had actually been in her periphery for years. They'd worked together on translation projects. They'd had lunches, conversations. He'd even asked her out once, 2 years earlier, and she'd declined, finding him too ordinary, too available, too lacking in the mysterious intensity she thought was passion but was actually her father complex, recognizing familiar unavailability. Now with her new eyes that had been trained through 2 years of shadow work and animus integration to see reality rather than projection, she saw him completely differently. He wasn't ordinary. He was stable. He wasn't boring. He was present. He wasn't lacking intensity. He was offering something she'd never encountered before: genuine availability. They had coffee, and Anna noticed something astonishing. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to charm or dazzle or be the entertaining version of herself. She was just herself, authentic, present, and it felt natural, not terrifying. Michael later told her he'd been attracted to her for years, but something had always held him back. "You always seemed like you were performing," he said, "like you weren't really there. I couldn't figure out who you actually were beneath all that charm. But now I can see you, and you're more beautiful than the performance ever was." This is the crucial insight, the version of Anna that her father complex had created. The performing, charming, perfectly put together Anna had been visible to men for years. Many had been attracted to it. But the authentic Anna, the one who had done the work of integration, the one who was genuinely present, that Anna had been invisible until she became visible to herself first. Their relationship developed slowly, not with the intense, desperate urgency of Anna's previous connections, but with a gradual deepening that felt solid rather than intoxicating. There were challenges, certainly. Old patterns would occasionally resurface. Her panic when he was fully available, her impulse to create artificial distance, her fear that being truly seen would lead to abandonment. But now she had tools, she had consciousness. When she felt the old panic rising, she didn't act on it immediately. She examined it. She dialogued with it. She asked, "Is this about Michael, or is this my father complex speaking? Is this a real problem, or is this my psyche trying to recreate the familiar pattern?" And Michael, it turned out, had done his own work. He wasn't a perfect, fully individuated person. Jung believed that was impossible. But he was conscious enough to recognize when Anna was struggling with her patterns, rather than reacting to something he'd actually done. He could give her space without abandoning her. He could remain present without becoming controlling. He had enough of a developed self that he didn't need Anna to be his missing pieces. About 6 months into their relationship, Anna had a session with Jung where she described something that had happened the previous week. Michael had been completely present with her. They'd spent an entire evening talking deeply, vulnerably, with no performance on either side. And instead of feeling the usual panic, she'd felt something else. Profound gratitude, relief, a sense of coming home. "I realized something," she told Jung. "I've been terrified of being met because I thought being met would mean being found lacking, but being met actually means being found, period. Not judged, not evaluated, just seen. And it turns out I can survive being seen. More than survive, I can thrive in it." Jung's notes from that session include a comment that captures his core insight. Patient has discovered that readiness for love was not about becoming perfect, but about becoming present. Not about eliminating vulnerability, but about developing the capacity to be vulnerable without fragmenting. She sought love for years while running from the only thing that makes love possible, authentic selfhood. Anna and Michael's relationship continued to deepen, not without challenges. Real intimacy always involves difficulty, Jung insisted. But the difficulties were different now. They were growing pains rather than death spirals. They were about two people learning to share space rather than merge into unconsciousness. About a year into the relationship, they made plans to marry. And Anna noticed something that brought tears to her eyes when she told Jung about it. She wasn't desperate for the wedding, wasn't frantically planning it as proof of her worthiness, wasn't trying to lock Michael down before he could leave. She wanted to marry him because their partnership was genuinely enriching both their lives, because they'd proven they could face challenges without destroying each other, because she'd discovered that true commitment isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about two complete people choosing to interweave their completeness. In one of their final sessions, Jung's work with patients often ended organically rather than abruptly. Anna reflected on the entire journey. "I spent 15 years chasing love while running from myself. I thought the universe was punishing me, keeping love away. Now I understand it was protecting me. Every failed relationship, every heartbreak, every moment of loneliness was actually the universe saying, 'Not yet. You're not ready yet. Keep working. Keep becoming." She paused and then said something Jung recorded in his notes as one of the most profound statements he'd heard from a patient. "The universe didn't delay love because I was unworthy. It delayed love until I was whole. And now that I'm whole, not perfect, not finished, but whole enough, love doesn't feel like rescue anymore. It feels like recognition. Michael didn't complete me. He recognized me. And I could only be recognized once I'd finally recognized myself." This is the transformation that Jung observed repeatedly in his practice, not from unworthy to worthy, but from unconscious to conscious, not from broken to fixed, but from fragmented to integrated, not from alone to coupled, but from abandoned to present, present first with yourself, which then makes genuine presence with another possible. Anna's case reveals the core architecture of readiness. She didn't become ready for love by finding the right person. She became ready for love by doing the specific psychological work that readiness requires: shadow integration, acknowledging and reclaiming the parts of herself she'd rejected; parent complex resolution, consciously separating from her father's influence and healing the childhood wound she'd been recreating in adult relationships; animus development, building her own inner masculine so she wasn't seeking it desperately in external men; self-development, establishing a coherent center that could engage in relationship without dissolving into it; and crucially, solitude mastery, learning to be genuinely alone without loneliness, using solitude for growth rather than seeing it as a problem to solve with a relationship. Only after completing this work, and it took 2 full years of intensive analysis plus continued integration, was she capable of the kind of conscious relationship she'd been seeking all along. The universe delayed love until she was ready to receive it fully, not as punishment but as the ultimate act of protection and preparation. And when love finally arrived, it arrived not as the fantasy rescue she'd been chasing, but as something infinitely better, a meeting between 2 people who had each done the work of becoming real. Now, here's where Jung's clinical observations from a century ago meet the cutting edge of contemporary neuroscience and psychology, because what Jung intuited through deep clinical work, modern science has confirmed through rigorous research. The concept of relational readiness isn't mystical speculation. It's measurable, observable, and grounded in how the human brain and psyche actually develop. Let's start with attachment theory, which has become the dominant framework for understanding relationship patterns in modern psychology. In the 1950s and 60s, researchers John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth discovered something that would revolutionize our understanding of love. The relationship patterns you form in the first 2 years of life create templates that determine your capacity for intimacy as an adult. These aren't just memories or learned behaviors. They're neural pathways literally wired into the architecture of your developing brain. Ainsworth's strange situation experiments revealed 3 primary attachment styles in children, which predict adult relationship patterns with disturbing accuracy. Securely attached children had caregivers who were consistently responsive, emotionally available, and attuned. These children grew into adults capable of healthy intimacy. They could be close without being clingy, autonomous without being distant. But the other 2 styles reveal exactly what Jung was observing in patients like Anna. Anxiously attached children had caregivers who were inconsistently available, present sometimes, absent others, creating a pattern of uncertain love. These children grew into adults who are desperate for closeness but terrified of abandonment. They pursue intimacy frantically while simultaneously testing it constantly, creating the exact push-pull dynamic Jung observed. Sound familiar? This was Anna's pattern, created by her diplomat father who was periodically present but fundamentally unpredictable. Avoidantly attached children had caregivers who were consistently distant, dismissive of emotional needs. These children learned that their needs wouldn't be met, so they stopped expressing them. They grew into adults who claim they don't need intimacy, who prioritize independence over connection, who unconsciously choose partners who can't get close enough to threaten their defended hearts. Here's where it connects to Jung's concept of the Unready Heart Syndrome. These attachment patterns aren't just psychological, they're neurological. Brain imaging studies show that people with different attachment styles have measurably different patterns of activation in the limbic system, the brain's emotional center when processing relationship scenarios. A groundbreaking 2017 study by neuroscientist Lane Becks used fMRI scanning to observe what happens in the brain when people in relationships face threats. Securely attached individuals showed integrated activation between emotional centers and prefrontal cortex. They could feel emotions while maintaining the cognitive capacity to regulate them. But anxiously attached individuals showed hyperactivation in the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex. Their threat detection systems were in constant overdrive, perceiving danger even in safe relationships. Their brains were literally wired to expect abandonment. And avoidantly attached individuals showed suppressed activation in emotional centers altogether. They'd trained their brains to shut down feeling as a protection mechanism. This is crucial. Readiness for love isn't just about attitude or willpower. Your brain needs to be literally rewired before it can sustain healthy intimacy. The neural pathways created in childhood determine your capacity for adult relationship. And changing those pathways requires intensive, sustained work, exactly the kind of work Jung was facilitating with patients like Anna. Modern neuroscience has even identified the mechanism, neuroplasticity. The brain can rewire itself, but it requires specific conditions. You need new experiences that contradict old patterns, repeated consistently over time, in emotionally significant contexts. This is precisely what happens in effective therapy, particularly in approaches influenced by Jung's work. When Anna did shadow work, when she dialogued with her father complex, when she learned to sit with discomfort rather than immediately seeking relationship as escape, she was literally rewiring her neural pathways. The brain she brought to her relationship with Michael was measurably different from the brain she brought to her 18 previous failed relationships. Now let's talk about projection, which Jung considered central to immature love. In 2014, researchers at the University of Groningen conducted a fascinating study on projection in new relationships. They had participants rate themselves on various personality traits, rate their new partners on the same traits, and then had the partners rate themselves. The findings confirmed Jung's century-old insights. In the early stages of relationship, people's ratings of their partners correlated more strongly with their own self-ratings than with the partner's self-ratings. In other words, you don't see your partner, you see yourself reflected back. You project your own qualities, your own needs, your own unintegrated psychic content onto them. The researchers found this projection was strongest in people with poor self-awareness and unresolved attachment issues, exactly the population Jung would identify as having an unready heart. And the projection decreased over time in successful relationships as people developed more accurate understanding of who their partner actually was. But here's the disturbing finding. In relationships that failed, projection never decreased. People remained locked in their fantasy of who their partner was, becoming increasingly disappointed as the real person failed to match the projected image. This is the projection trap Jung warned about. You fall in love with your own anima or animus image, not with the actual human before you. Another dimension of modern research confirms Jung's insights about anima and animus. While Jung's language was gendered, anima as the unconscious feminine in men, animus as the unconscious masculine in women, contemporary psychology reframes this as self-expansions or unexpressed potentials. Dr. Arthur Aaron's research at Stony Brook University demonstrates that we're attracted to people who embody qualities we lack but desire. The problem Jung identified is that without conscious integration of these qualities in ourselves, we become dependent on the other person to provide them. We outsource our own development to our partner. Aaron's studies show that healthy relationships involve what he calls self-expansion. Each partner develops new capacities through the relationship, but this only happens when there's enough differentiated self to begin with. Without that foundation, couples don't expand. They merge into codependent systems where neither can grow. This connects to the work of Murray Bowen, who developed the concept of differentiation of self, the capacity to maintain your own values, beliefs, and identity while in intimate connection with another. Bowen found that couples with low differentiation become fused, losing their individual identities and creating toxic patterns of enmeshment, reactivity, and mutual possession. His research showed that differentiation isn't something that happens in relationship. It's something you must bring to relationship. Sound familiar? This is Jung's argument exactly. Individuation must reach a critical threshold before you're capable of conscious partnership. Stan Tatkin, a contemporary relationship therapist, has built his entire approach around what he calls secure functioning relationships. His research confirms Jung's observation that most people enter relationships seeking to feel secure rather than offering security from a place of internal wholeness. The seeking creates instability. The offering creates genuine partnership. Tatkin's work demonstrates that relationships succeed when both partners have done sufficient individual work to operate from what he calls relational purpose, the conscious choice to prioritize the relationship's well-being alongside individual needs. But this is only possible when you have a solid enough self that relationship doesn't feel like identity annihilation. Now let's address timing, which Jung observed was rarely random. A comprehensive 2018 study published in the Journal of Marriage and Family tracked over 2,000 relationships over 15 years. The researchers found that relationships begun during periods of personal instability, major life transitions, unresolved trauma, career uncertainty, or what they called identity flux, had failure rates over 60% higher than relationships begun during periods of relative stability. The study's conclusion could have been written by Jung. Individuals who enter committed relationships before establishing stable individual identity, emotional regulation capacity, and clear life direction are significantly more likely to experience relationship dissolution or chronic relationship distress. Translation: the universe's delay isn't punitive, it's protective. When you're not ready, when you're in identity flux, when you haven't healed major wounds, when you're using relationship as escape from self-confrontation, even a perfect partner won't create a successful relationship. Esther Perel, perhaps the most prominent contemporary voice on relationships, has built her work around a Jungian insight. The quality of the relationship you create depends on the quality of self you bring to it. Her research shows that couples who maintain individuality within intimacy, what she calls eroticism born from distance, report higher satisfaction than couples who merge completely. But maintaining individuality requires having an individuality to maintain. Perel's work confirms that the people most desperately seeking merger are often those with the weakest sense of autonomous self. They're seeking relationship as identity rather than seeking to share an already formed identity. Sue Johnson, founder of emotionally focused therapy, has spent 3 decades researching what makes relationships succeed or fail. Her findings align perfectly with Jung's observations about readiness. Successful couples, she's found, can engage in what she calls hold me tight conversations, deep emotional connection that requires the ability to be vulnerable without fragmenting. But vulnerability without fragmentation requires something crucial: emotional regulation capacity. This is the ability to feel intense emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to stay present in discomfort rather than immediately seeking escape. Johnson's research shows that this capacity isn't innate. It's developed through specific processes. Childhood attachment experiences lay the foundation. Trauma resolution builds capacity. Therapeutic work creates new neural pathways. And crucially, sustained solitude, where you learn to regulate your own emotional states without depending on another person. This last point confirms Jung's observation that solitude mastery is prerequisite to intimacy readiness. If you can't self-regulate, you'll use your partner as an emotional regulation device, demanding they manage your anxiety, your emptiness, your fear. This creates what Johnson calls attachment panic, where the relationship becomes about emotional survival rather than emotional connection. Neuroscientist Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory provides the biological mechanism underlying this. He's demonstrated that the vagus nerve, which regulates your nervous system's response to threat and safety, develops its capacity through co-regulation in infancy and self-regulation in adolescence and adulthood. People who never develop self-regulation capacity remain stuck in what Porges calls sympathetic activation, a chronic state of threat response where they're either in fight-flight, anxious attachment, or freeze-shutdown, avoidant attachment. They literally cannot access the social engagement system that allows for genuine intimacy because their nervous systems are in survival mode. The transformation Jung facilitated with patients like Anna was partly neurological, teaching the nervous system to feel safe enough to open to connection. This requires sustained practice being alone without loneliness, experiencing discomfort without escaping, feeling emotions without being controlled by them. Modern trauma research, particularly the work of Bessel van der Kolk, confirms that traumatized individuals, and most people, carry some relational trauma, need specialized work to become relationally ready. His studies show that trauma creates fragmentation in the brain, disrupting the integration between emotional and cognitive centers. Healing requires specific processes: building present moment awareness, mindfulness, developing emotion regulation, distress tolerance, processing traumatic memories and integration, and establishing secure attachment patterns, often through therapy. This work takes time. Van der Kolk's research suggests significant trauma healing requires minimum 2 years of sustained work. 2 years. That's how long Anna worked with Jung before she was ready for conscious relationship with Michael. This isn't coincidence. It's the minimum time required for substantial neurological rewiring and psychological integration. Perhaps most validating of Jung's insights are studies on what researchers call self-determination or autonomous functioning. Decades of research by Edward Dacey and Richard Ryan demonstrate that people with strong autonomous functioning, clear values, internal motivation, coherent identity report dramatically higher relationship satisfaction than those with weak autonomous functioning. The counterintuitive finding: the more differentiated and autonomous you are, the better your relationships. The more you need a relationship, the worse it tends to be. This paradox perfectly captures Jung's insight that readiness for union comes from wholeness, not from incompleteness seeking completion. There's even research on the specific timing of when people become ready. Developmental psychologist Jeffrey Arnett's work on emerging adulthood shows that most people don't develop a stable identity until their late 20s at earliest. The brain's prefrontal cortex, the center for self-regulation, long-term planning, and integrated decision-making, doesn't fully mature until age 25 to 30. This explains why relationships formed in earlier years have higher failure rates. Not because young people don't know how to love, but because they haven't yet developed the neurological capacity for sustained intimacy with another differentiated self. They're attempting advanced relationship capacity with an intermediate nervous system. Contemporary research has also confirmed Jung's observation about what happens when unready people meet. They don't create readiness, they create shared dysfunction. Studies on assortative mating show that people tend to pair with others at similar levels of psychological development. Two anxiously attached people create relationships of mutual panic and constant testing. Two avoidantly attached people create relationships of distant companionship with no real intimacy. An anxious person with an avoidant person creates the classic pursuer-distancer dynamic, where both people's worst fears are constantly confirmed. But here's the hopeful finding. Research shows these patterns can change. Relationships can become earned, secure attachment when both partners commit to conscious work. But this requires exactly what Jung prescribed: individual work becoming shared work, both people developing consciousness and bringing it to the partnership. The most recent frontier in relationship research involves something called mentalization, the capacity to understand your own and others' mental states. Studies show that high mentalization capacity predicts relationship success, while low mentalization capacity predicts dysfunction. What is mentalization? It's the ability to see beneath surface behavior to underlying emotions, motivations, fears, to recognize when your partner's criticism is actually their fear speaking, to understand when your own anger is actually hurt, to distinguish between reality and projection. This is essentially Jung's concept of psychological consciousness applied to relationships, and research shows it can be developed, but only through the kind of inner work Jung prescribed. Shadow work increases mentalization, projection awareness increases mentalization, understanding your complexes increases mentalization. All of this research points to one conclusion: Jung was right. Love readiness isn't about luck or finding the right person. It's about psychological development that must occur before you're capable of sustaining conscious intimacy. It's about neural rewiring, attachment healing, differentiation building, and self-development that typically takes years of focused work. The universe, or your own deep psyche responding to your level of development, delays love until you've completed enough of this work. Not all of it. Jung insisted individuation is never complete, but enough. A critical threshold where your brain can handle intimacy without shutting down, where your psyche can engage vulnerability without fragmenting, where your self is solid enough that another person enhances rather than defines you. Modern science has given us the mechanisms: neural pathways, attachment templates, regulation capacity, mentalization, differentiation. But Jung gave us the map, and the map says, the work isn't finding love. The work is becoming someone who can receive love when it arrives. Every study we've discussed, every research finding, every neuroscience discovery confirms the same pattern Jung observed. Clinically, premature love doesn't heal unreadiness. It amplifies it, and the psyche, in its wisdom, protects you from that amplification until you've built the capacity to handle intimacy without being destroyed by it. The delay is the preparation. The loneliness is the crucible. The waiting is the transformation. And when the work is done, not perfectly, but sufficiently, love arrives not as rescue, but as recognition. Two prepared psyches meeting and creating something that wouldn't have been possible before the preparation was complete. Jung discovered that psychological unreadiness doesn't express itself uniformly. Over decades of clinical practice, he observed distinct patterns, archetypal configurations of how the unprepared psyche approaches relationship. These aren't rigid categories, but recognizable constellations, ways the unconscious organizes itself around the wound of incompleteness. Understanding which pattern dominates your psyche is crucial, because each requires different specific work. You can't heal what you can't see. And most people spend their lives repeating the same relational pattern, never realizing it's a pattern at all, convinced that if they just found a different type of person, everything would change. But Jung knew. The person isn't the problem, the pattern is the problem, and the pattern lives in you, expressing itself through your unconscious choices, your attractions, your repulsions, your behaviors in intimacy. Let me introduce you to the 7 faces of unreadiness. As I describe each, notice which one activates something in you, not which one you think describes you intellectually, but which one makes you uncomfortable, defensive, recognized. That's the one you need to examine most closely. Type 1. The wounded healer. This is perhaps the most dangerous pattern because it disguises itself as virtue. The wounded healer enters relationships as rescue operations. They're attracted to broken people, damaged souls, those who are clearly struggling, and they're convinced their attraction is compassion, empathy, the desire to help. They believe they're evolved because they can see potential in people others have given up on. But Jung would ask, what are you avoiding in yourself by focusing so intensely on healing others? The wounded healer's pattern is this. They choose partners who need fixing so they never have to face their own brokenness. They become the therapist, the savior, the one who's got it together. They derive their identity and value from being the helper. And as long as they're helping someone else, they don't have to acknowledge their own wounds, their own needs, their own pain. Clinically, Jung observed that wounded healers often came from families where they had to caretake a parent, an alcoholic father, a depressed mother, a mentally ill sibling. They learned early that their value came from managing others' pain, and they bring this dynamic into adult relationships, unconsciously seeking partners who will require caretaking because that's the only form of intimacy they know. The relationship always follows the same pattern: intense beginning where the wounded healer feels needed and purposeful, a middle phase where they exhaust themselves trying to fix the partner, and eventually either the partner leaves, often becoming healthier and finding someone else, or the wounded healer collapses under the weight of being the sole source of stability. What makes this pattern so insidious is that it's culturally rewarded. We celebrate people who stand by difficult partners, who see the best in troubled souls, who love unconditionally despite mistreatment. But Jung saw the shadow side. This isn't unconditional love. It's conditional self-worth. The wounded healer needs someone to be broken so they can feel whole. The work required. The wounded healer must face their own wounds directly, without the distraction of someone else's crisis. They must learn to receive care rather than only giving it. They must discover they have value beyond their utility. And most painfully, they must acknowledge that their attraction to broken people isn't compassion, it's unconscious self-protection. True readiness for the wounded healer comes when they can be attracted to someone who's already whole, already healthy, already capable, and not feel unnecessary or without purpose, when they can show up as a partner rather than a savior, when they can love someone who doesn't need them to love themselves. Type 2. The eternal child. Jung called this pattern puer aeternus in men or puella eterna in women, the eternal boy or girl. This is the person who remains in a state of perpetual adolescence, refusing the psychological death that growing up requires. The eternal child approaches relationship as magical union. They're seeking a fairy tale, a soulmate in the most literal sense, someone who completes them so perfectly that they never have to face adult responsibility. They believe in destiny, in meant to be, in love that requires no work because it's cosmically perfect. You can recognize the eternal child by their language. When I meet the one, I'll just know. Real love doesn't require effort. If it's meant to be, it will happen effortlessly. My person is out there somewhere, and when we find each other, everything will fall into place. This sounds romantic. It's actually terror disguised as idealism. What is the eternal child terrified of? Limitation, commitment, the death of infinite possibility. Growing up means accepting that choosing one path means not choosing others, that committing to one person means foreclosing other options, that adult life requires sacrifice, compromise, sustained effort. The eternal child wants relationship without these costs. They want the intensity of new love, which is actually just neurochemical flooding, without the inevitable plateau into steady partnership. They want the fantasy without the reality. Jung observed that eternal children often had parents who either smothered them, preventing healthy separation, or abandoned them, preventing healthy attachment. Either way, they never completed the developmental task of adolescence, individuating from parents and forming an adult identity. So they bring a child's psyche to adult relationships. They need constant novelty, constant validation, constant excitement. The moment relationship becomes predictable, which all healthy relationships do, they experience it as death and start looking for the next new thing. The pattern is obvious once you see it. They fall intensely, quickly. They idealize the partner. They talk about futures they have no capacity to build. Then, always when real commitment is required, moving in together, meeting families, making long-term plans, they panic. Suddenly they notice flaws they couldn't see before. Suddenly they need space. Suddenly they realize this person isn't the one after all. And they move on to the next person, convinced that this time it will be different, never realizing they're the constant in every equation. The work required. The eternal child must consciously grieve the death of infinite possibility. They must accept limitation not as prison but as the precondition for depth. They must learn that real love isn't the perpetual high of novelty. It's the sustained commitment to growth through difficulty. Most painfully, they must face the adult responsibilities they've been avoiding: financial stability, emotional regulation, the capacity for sustained effort toward long-term goals. Jung's term for what they're avoiding is sacrifice, not in the sense of suffering, but in the original meaning, making sacred. To make something sacred, you must give up everything else. To commit to one path, one person, one life, you must sacrifice the fantasy of having all paths, all people, all lives. True readiness for the eternal child comes when they can feel the pull toward new attraction, new possibility, new excitement, and choose to stay anyway. Not out of obligation or fear, but from genuine understanding that depth requires time, that real intimacy develops through seasons of boredom and challenge, that the person who stays is not less evolved than the person who keeps seeking. They're more evolved. Type 3. The projector. This is the pattern Jung spent the most time analyzing because it's nearly universal in unconscious relationships. The projector doesn't fall in love with people. They fall in love with their own anima or animus images, mistaking inner templates for outer reality. Here's how it works. Your psyche contains images of the ideal partner, formed from childhood experiences, cultural conditioning, personal wounds, and archetypal patterns. Jung called these the anima, the unconscious feminine in men, or animus, the unconscious masculine in women. These images are projections of your own undeveloped qualities. The projector meets someone who vaguely resembles these inner images and immediately projects the full template onto them. They don't see the actual person. They see their own psychic content reflected back, and they fall in love with this projection, this fantasy, this image that exists primarily in their own unconscious. You can recognize projectors by how quickly and intensely they fall. They meet someone, and within days or weeks, they're absolutely certain this is their person. They describe qualities in their new partner that friends who know the partner can't see. They're already planning a future based on who they imagine this person to be, rather than who they actually are. The relationship always follows a devastating pattern: intense idealization phase where the projector is in love with their projection, then inevitable disillusionment when the real person emerges and fails to match the fantasy, then blame, betrayal narratives, conviction that the partner deceived them or changed. But Jung would say, the partner didn't deceive you. You deceived yourself. You fell in love with your own psyche and are now angry at the other person for not being your projection. I've seen this pattern countless times. A man meets a woman and immediately sees her as his anima, his perfect feminine, embodying all the qualities of sensitivity, nurturing, emotional depth he hasn't developed in himself. He projects total femininity onto her. Then when she reveals she's also ambitious, assertive, independent, qualities that don't match his anima template, he feels betrayed. She's not who I thought she was, he says. Jung would respond, she never was who you thought. You never saw her at all. Or a woman meets a man and projects her animus onto him, her ideal masculine, strong, decisive, protective. She surrenders to this projection, making him responsible for direction and meaning in her life. Then when he reveals vulnerability, uncertainty, his own need for support, qualities that don't match her animus template, she loses attraction. He's weak, she says. Jung would respond, he's human. You wanted a god because you haven't developed your own inner strength. The work required. The projector must learn to retrieve their projections. This is technical Jungian work. When you feel intense attraction or idealization, you must pause and ask, what quality am I seeing in this person that actually exists in me but remains undeveloped? If you're attracted to someone's confidence, you must develop your own confidence. If you're attracted to someone's creativity, you must engage your own creativity. If you're attracted to someone's emotional depth, you must explore your own emotional depth. Jung's principle, whatever you're seeking in another exists as potential within yourself. The intensity of attraction corresponds to the degree of projection. Mild attraction might be genuine compatibility. Overwhelming, obsessive attraction is nearly always projection. You're falling in love with yourself. True readiness for the projector comes when they can be attracted to someone without immediately creating an elaborate fantasy about who that person is, when they can stay curious rather than certain, when they can allow the real person to emerge gradually rather than demanding they match a pre-existing template, when they can say, I'm interested in discovering who you actually are, rather than, I know exactly who you are. Type 4. The defended heart. This pattern is the opposite of the eternal child. Instead of too open, they're too closed. The defended heart has built such elaborate armor against vulnerability that they unconsciously choose partners who will never threaten their defenses. Jung observed that severe childhood wounding, neglect, abuse, betrayal often creates this pattern. The child learns that vulnerability leads to pain, so they construct psychological defenses as survival mechanisms. These defenses work beautifully in childhood, protecting the fragile developing psyche from unbearable harm. But in adulthood, these same defenses prevent intimacy. The defended heart still operates as if vulnerability equals annihilation, so they cannot allow anyone truly close. They cannot be seen, known, or vulnerable without experiencing panic at an almost cellular level. Here's the insidious part. The defended heart doesn't realize they're defending. They genuinely believe they want intimacy. They pursue relationships. They date. They even commit. But watch carefully and you'll see. They only pursue people who are unavailable, inappropriate, or unable to meet them at depth. The married person, the emotionally damaged person, the geographically distant person, the person still in love with their ex, the person with clear incompatibilities. The defended heart is drawn to these people because they offer the perfect setup. I can be in relationship without real intimacy. I can be vulnerable without real risk. I can appear open while remaining protected. Or they choose someone who is available, but then the defended heart ensures superficiality. They keep conversation light. They deflect deep questions. They share facts about their life, but never feelings. They have sex, but not emotional vulnerability. They're present, but not truly there. Jung noticed that defended hearts often describe their ideal partner as someone low maintenance, someone who doesn't require much emotionally, someone who gives them space. They frame this as knowing what they need, but Jung would see it as announcing exactly what they're avoiding: emotional demand, vulnerability requirement, true closeness. The pattern reveals itself over time. Relationships that look functional from outside but are hollow at the core. Partners who describe feeling lonely despite being in relationship. The defended heart seems perfect, successful, independent, stable, but impossible to truly reach. What are they defending against? Not the other person. The terror of being seen and rejected. The wound from childhood when being seen led to abandonment, criticism, or harm. The belief that their authentic self is unlovable, so they must maintain the defense at all costs. The work required. The defended heart must consciously, deliberately lower their armor, not with just anyone, but in safe therapeutic or analytical containers first. They must experience being vulnerable without being destroyed. They must have corrective experiences where being seen leads to acceptance rather than rejection. This is delicate work. Demanding that a defended heart just be vulnerable in relationship is like demanding someone take off their armor in battle. They need to learn that relationship isn't battle first. They need to rewire the nervous system that perceives intimacy as threat. True readiness for the defended heart comes when they can feel their defenses activating. The urge to deflect, change subject, create distance, and choose vulnerability anyway. Not constantly, not without boundaries, but in moments of genuine invitation from a trustworthy partner. When they can say, "This is terrifying, but I'm going to tell you anyway," and survive the experience. Type 5. The merger. If the defended heart's problem is too much boundary, the merger's problem is no boundary at all. They have no differentiated self, so they enter relationships as psychological fusion, losing all autonomy and then resenting the partner for their own self-abandonment. Jung saw this pattern as arrested development. The person never completed the separation-individuation process that should occur in adolescence. They remain psychologically fused with others, unable to distinguish where they end and another begins. The merger meets someone and immediately begins absorbing their reality. They take on the partner's interests, opinions, friend groups, lifestyle. They describe this as compromise or flexibility, but Jung would see it as identity diffusion. They have no stable center, so they organize around whoever they're with. This feels like deep love to the merger. They experience the fusion as profound connection. They say things like, We're so close, we're like one person, not realizing this is a description of pathology, not healthy intimacy. The pattern unfolds predictably. Initial phase where the merger creates perfect union by abandoning themselves. The partner often loves this at first. Someone who agrees with everything, wants to do everything together, seems completely devoted. But gradually the partner begins feeling suffocated. They need space. They need the merger to have their own life. And this request devastates the merger, who experiences any separateness as rejection. Why do you need space? Don't you want to be with me? Are you falling out of love? They cannot understand that healthy intimacy requires two separate people. They believe love means merger, and any movement toward autonomy feels like abandonment. Eventually, either the partner leaves, exhausted by the merger's neediness and lack of self, or the merger explodes in resentment. Because beneath the fusion, they're furious that they've abandoned themselves, furious that their partner hasn't made them feel complete, furious that losing themselves didn't create the security they were seeking. Jung identified this as the most common pattern in codependent relationships. Two mergers meeting creates complete enmeshment, a relationship where neither person exists as an individual anymore, where every decision requires consensus, where separation is impossible. Or a merger with any other type creates an imbalanced dynamic where the merger demands fusion and the partner feels increasingly trapped. The work required. The merger must develop what Bowen called differentiation of self, the capacity to maintain their own beliefs, values, interests, and identity while in intimate relationship. This requires conscious practice of autonomy. They must develop their own hobbies, friendships, opinions, not to spite their partner, but to discover who they are. They must learn to tolerate the anxiety of separateness, which for them feels like existential threat. They must discover that healthy relationships require two people, not one merged entity. Most challenging, they must learn to self-soothe. Mergers use their partners as anxiety regulation devices. When they feel distress, they immediately seek the partner's presence, comfort, reassurance. They must learn to sit with discomfort alone, to calm themselves, to exist independently of another's soothing presence. True readiness for the merger comes when they can be in relationship and also be separate, when they can say, I'm going to spend the day alone doing something just for me, without experiencing it as rejection or abandonment, when they can hear their partner's different opinion and not feel threatened, when they can maintain their sense of self even in deep intimacy. Type 6, the perpetual seeker. This pattern is endemic in modern dating culture. The perpetual seeker is addicted to the falling in love neurochemistry, constantly chasing new connections while sabotaging anything that moves toward depth and commitment. Jung would recognize this immediately. They're not seeking love. They're seeking the altered state that novelty creates. The dopamine flood, the obsessive thinking, the fantasy, the intensity. They've confused the neurochemical experience of new attraction with love itself. Neuroscience confirms this is literally an addiction pattern. Early-stage romantic love activates the same brain regions as cocaine, the ventral tegmental area and caudate nucleus, flooding the system with dopamine. This creates euphoria, obsessive focus, decreased need for sleep, loss of appetite. It feels incredible. But like any drug, tolerance develops. After 3 to 18 months, the neurochemistry normalizes. The obsessive intensity fades. The relationship enters what researchers call companionate love. Less intensity, more stability. Different neurochemistry, activating regions associated with attachment and bonding rather than reward and craving. For healthy people, this transition is welcome, moving from intoxication to intimacy. But for the perpetual seeker, this feels like death. The moment the intensity fades, they experience it as falling out of love. They start noticing flaws. They feel restless, bored, trapped. They begin fantasizing about new connections, and eventually they engineer an exit. Then they repeat the cycle with someone new, and the pattern continues indefinitely. Serial intensity, serial infatuation, never moving beyond the neurochemical phase into actual relationship. Jung saw this in patients constantly. They would describe their relationship history as a series of passionate beginnings and disappointing middles. They would say, "I keep meeting the wrong people," never realizing they're incapable of staying with anyone long enough to discover if they're right or wrong. The perpetual seeker often has a trauma history or attachment wounds that make sustained intimacy terrifying. The intensity phase is safe. You can't actually be hurt in 3 months of fantasy. But once the neurochemistry fades and real relationship begins, with its demands for vulnerability, its revelation of flaws, its requirement for sustained presence, the terror activates and they run. Modern dating culture enables this pattern perfectly. Dating apps provide an endless stream of new possibilities, always suggesting that someone better might be one swipe away. This feeds the seeker's core delusion that the right person will create sustained intensity without effort, the work required. The perpetual seeker must recognize their addiction and consciously choose to stay through the neurochemical transition. They must experience the plateau, the place where intensity fades, without fleeing. They must discover that real intimacy begins where infatuation ends. This requires almost physical withdrawal management. When the urge to seek novelty activates, they must sit with it rather than act on it. When they notice flaws in their partner, they must recognize this as neurochemical normalization rather than evidence of wrong choice. When they feel bored, they must understand this as their nervous system adjusting to safety rather than a problem to solve by leaving. They must also examine what they're avoiding, what becomes possible in sustained relationship that terrifies them. Usually, being truly known, which requires staying long enough that the performance drops and the authentic self emerges. True readiness for the perpetual seeker comes when they can feel the pull toward new attraction, the dopamine hit of possibility, and recognize it for what it is, brain chemistry, not destiny. When they can value depth over intensity, presence over passion, sustained commitment over exciting beginnings. When they can say, this relationship isn't intoxicating anymore, and that means it's becoming real. Type 7. The shadow avoider. This is the most unconscious pattern, and Jung considered it almost universal until sufficient inner work is done. The shadow avoider seeks partners who embody their rejected qualities, creating relationships as battlegrounds for internal conflicts they won't face directly. Here's the mechanism. Every person has a shadow, the parts of themselves they've rejected as unacceptable, pushed into the unconscious. These might be qualities they were shamed for in childhood, qualities that contradict their self-image, or qualities they've deemed morally unacceptable. Common shadow material: anger, neediness, selfishness, sexuality, ambition, laziness, irrationality, rigidity. Whatever you most criticize in others is usually your own shadow content. The shadow avoider, unconsciously seeking integration but unable to do it internally, projects these rejected qualities onto partners. Then they enter relationship with someone who embodies their shadow, creating an external battleground for an internal conflict. Example: a man who prides himself on being logical, rational, and controlled is attracted to a woman who is emotional, spontaneous, and expressive. He claims he loves these qualities. They're exotic to him, fascinating, attractive. But watch what happens over time. He begins criticizing her emotionality as too much, Her spontaneity becomes irresponsibility. Her expressiveness becomes drama. What's really happening? She's embodying all the qualities he rejected in himself. His own emotionality, spontaneity, irrationality. He's attracted to his shadow but also terrified of it. So he tries to control it in her, to suppress it, to manage it. The relationship becomes a war over who gets to express what he cannot allow in himself, or a woman who prides herself on being selfless, giving and accommodating is attracted to a man who is boundaried, assertive, and prioritizes himself. Initially, she admires these qualities, but over time, she criticizes him as selfish, cold, uncaring. What's happening? He's embodying the self-assertion and healthy selfishness she's rejected in herself. She's attracted to her shadow but cannot integrate it, so she attacks it in him. Jung observed this pattern in nearly every conflicted relationship he analyzed. Partners weren't fighting about dishes or money or sex. They were fighting about disowned parts of themselves that the other person was mirroring. The tragedy is that these relationships contain exactly what each person needs for wholeness. The logical man needs to integrate his emotionality. The selfless woman needs to integrate her healthy self-interest. Their partners are offering them mirrors of their own shadow material, but instead of recognizing the gift and doing the integration work, they attack the mirror. The work required. The shadow avoider must learn projection retrieval. Every intense criticism of a partner is an invitation to examine what you're seeing in them that exists in you. Every time you think, I can't stand that they're so quality, you must ask, where does this quality exist in me? Unexpressed. This doesn't mean the partner doesn't have the quality. They do. But your intense reaction to it indicates shadow material. Mild preference is just preference. Intense judgment is projection. Jung's shadow work requires you to consciously claim and integrate the rejected qualities. The logical man must allow himself to feel and express emotion. The selfless woman must practice healthy boundaries and self-prioritization. As you integrate your own shadow, your partner's expression of those qualities becomes less triggering. True readiness for the shadow avoider comes when you can observe qualities in your partner that differ from yours without judgment, when you can appreciate their different way of being without needing them to change, when you realize relationship isn't about finding someone who reflects only your acceptable qualities, but about finding someone whole enough that both your lights and shadows can coexist without warfare. These are the 7 faces of unreadiness. Most people are not purely one type. Usually you'll recognize yourself in 2 or 3 patterns, with one being dominant. The pattern that made you most uncomfortable while reading is likely the one most active in your psyche right now. Jung's crucial insight: these patterns aren't personality traits. They're defenses. Sophisticated ways your unconscious protects you from intimacy you're not yet equipped to handle. And they will continue operating until you do the specific inner work that each pattern requires. You cannot skip your pattern by finding the right person. You cannot overcome it through effort or willpower alone. You must bring consciousness to the unconscious material driving it. Do the integration work specific to your type, and develop the psychological capacities you're currently lacking. The universe delays love until you've recognized your pattern, understood why it exists, and begun the work of transformation. Because premature love doesn't heal these patterns, it amplifies them, creating relationship dynamics that harm both partners while preventing either from doing the individual work that would make them ready. Which face of unreadiness is yours? And more importantly, are you ready to do the work that face requires? Now we must speak of what most relationship advice carefully avoids: the catastrophic consequences of entering love before psychological readiness. because Jung didn't just observe that premature love fails, he observed that it destroys. It dismantles identities, arrests development, and can lead to what he called soul loss, a condition so profound that decades of one's life can be consumed trying to recover. This is uncomfortable material. Our culture romanticizes love, treating it as universally good, always healing, the answer to human loneliness. But Jung saw something else. He watched brilliant people enter relationships and vanish. He observed partnerships that looked like love but were actually mutual possession. Two people trapped in each other's unconscious complexes, creating psychological prisons they called intimacy. Let me show you what premature love destroys, in escalating order of severity. Danger 1. Identity annihilation. When two people without solid selves enter relationship, they don't create union, they create fusion. And fusion is not intimacy. It's the dissolution of two identities into a third entity that possesses both. Jung called this participation mystique, a term he borrowed from anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. It describes a state of unconscious identification where boundaries between self and other completely dissolve. In primitive cultures, this might manifest as believing you're identical with your totem animal. In modern relationships, it manifests as losing all sense of who you are separate from your partner. This happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. You start by spending all your time together, understandable in new love. Then you begin absorbing each other's interests, opinions, friend groups. You stop doing things independently. You make all decisions together. You can't imagine an experience that doesn't include them. At first, this feels like profound connection. You tell friends, "We're so close, we're practically the same person." You describe finishing each other's sentences, knowing what the other is thinking. You believe this is intimacy, but Jung would see it as the death of individuation, because you're not two whole people sharing your wholeness. You're two incomplete people creating one merged entity, and this merged entity is less than the sum of its parts, not more. Here's what happens over time. You wake up one day and don't recognize yourself. You can't remember what you liked before this relationship. You've lost touch with friends. Your career has stagnated because all your energy goes into the relationship. Your hobbies have disappeared. Your opinions have homogenized with your partner's. You've become a supporting character in a shared story, and you can't remember the story you were writing before. This is identity annihilation. And it's especially dangerous because it feels like love. It feels like devotion, like partnership, like profound connection. You're not being forced to lose yourself. You're willingly dissolving, mistaking the loss for union. Jung observed this repeatedly in his practice. Patients would come to him years into marriages, successful by all external measures, and describe feeling like ghosts. "I don't know who I am anymore," they would say. "I exist only in relation to my partner. I have no independent thoughts, desires, identity." And the recovery from this is brutal, because to reclaim yourself, you must often first lose the relationship. You must step back, create separation, risk the connection to rediscover the individual. Many people never do this. They remain in the fusion until death, having sacrificed their individuation journey for the security of merger. The preventative measure is simple in theory, difficult in practice. Enter relationship with a solid enough self that you can engage in intimacy without dissolving into it. Know who you are before you try to share who you are. Have your own life, interests, friendships, purpose, and maintain them within relationship, not as a rejection of partnership, but as the foundation that makes healthy partnership possible. Danger 2. The projection trap. We've discussed projection in the context of unreadiness. Now let me show you what happens when projected love is sustained over time. Premature love is almost always projected love. You fall in love with your anima or animus image, mistaking your own unconscious content for the actual person before you. In the early stages, this creates intoxication, but sustained over months or years, it creates something Jung considered one of the most destructive psychological dynamics, the disillusionment rage cycle. Here's the sequence. You meet someone who vaguely matches your internal template. You project your full anima or animus onto them. You fall in love with this projection, experiencing what feels like perfect union with your ideal. You make commitments based on this fantasy. You move in together, you marry, you have children. Then reality intrudes. The person reveals qualities that don't match your projection. They express needs you didn't anticipate. They fail to fulfill the role you unconsciously assigned them. And you experience this not as discovery, but as betrayal. You've changed, you say. But they haven't changed. You're just finally seeing them. The projection is lifting and the real person is emerging. But to your unconscious, which has been living in the fantasy, this feels like a bait and switch. You believe you were deceived. This is when the rage comes. Not anger at specific behaviors, but a deep existential fury, because you've organized your life around a fantasy, and now the fantasy is collapsing. You blame your partner for not being who you imagined. You attack them for failing to match the projection. You create elaborate narratives about how they tricked you, how they presented themselves falsely, how they're not the person you married. But Jung would say, they were never the person you married. You married your projection. You made vows to an internal image, not to the human standing before you. And now you're destroying both of you because you cannot bear to admit you were in love with yourself all along. I've watched this destroy countless relationships. The man who projected total femininity onto his wife, then feels betrayed when she returns to her career. The woman who projected strength onto her husband, then loses respect when he shows vulnerability. Both convinced their partner changed, when actually they never truly saw their partner at all. The most tragic version of this is when children are involved. Jung observed parents projecting their own unfulfilled potential onto children, then raging when the children develop their own identities. The father who demands his son be the athlete he never was. The mother who insists her daughter be the artist she never became. Projection turns relationships into psychological violence, all while the projector believes they're expressing love. The damage compounds over time. Years of projected relating means you've never actually known the person you're with. You've built a life with a stranger, mistaking your fantasy for familiarity. And when the projection inevitably collapses, through crisis, infidelity, or simply the grinding reality of time, you're left with nothing. No actual relationship to fall back on, because there never was one. Just two people performing for each other's projections. Danger 3. Arrested individuation. This is where Jung's analysis becomes truly radical. He proposed that every human has a developmental journey, individuation, where you become increasingly whole, integrated, conscious. You incorporate shadow material. You develop your anima or animus. You separate from parental complexes. You build a strong self. You discover your unique purpose. This is the hero's journey applied to psychological development, and it's not optional. The psyche demands it. If you refuse individuation, you experience increasing neurosis, depression, meaninglessness. Jung believed most midlife crises are actually stalled individuation demanding to be completed. Now, here's the danger: using relationship to avoid this journey. Many people enter relationships specifically to escape individuation work. The journey is painful. It requires facing shadow material, healing wounds, sitting with loneliness, confronting mortality, discovering authentic purpose. It's much easier to lose yourself in another person, to outsource your development to a partner, to use relationship as a distraction from self-confrontation, and premature love enables this perfectly. You're supposed to be doing the difficult work of becoming yourself, but instead you're consumed with relationship maintenance. You're supposed to be integrating your shadow, but instead you're projecting it onto your partner. You're supposed to be discovering your purpose, but instead your purpose becomes the relationship itself. Jung called this arrest because it stops your development. You remain frozen at whatever stage of individuation you'd reached when you entered the relationship. 20 years can pass, and psychologically, you're still the same person you were when you met. No growth, no development, no consciousness increase. This creates what Jung considered one of modern life's great tragedies. People who reach their 40s or 50s and realize they've become nothing. They've been a partner, maybe a parent, maybe a professional success, but they have no idea who they actually are. They've spent decades attending to relationships and responsibilities, while their true self, the person they were meant to become, has remained dormant, undeveloped, unfulfilled. The midlife crisis, in Jung's understanding, is the self-demanding recognition after decades of being ignored. And the demands often manifest destructively: affairs, divorces, radical career changes, breakdowns, because the psyche that has been arrested too long will create a crisis to force the growth that should have been happening all along. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. People who enter relationships young, before completing essential development, they use the relationship as refuge from individuation. Decades pass, then crisis hits. Often the partner begins their own individuation journey, or dies, or leaves, and suddenly they're forced to do at 50 the work they should have done at 25. And it's infinitely harder now. They have responsibilities, families, established patterns. The flexibility of youth is gone. The years when certain developments happen naturally have passed. They must do remedial psychological work while maintaining adult lives, often creating devastation for everyone involved. The prevention is clear: complete sufficient individuation before committing to long-term relationship. Not all of it. Jung insisted individuation is lifelong, but enough that you have a self to bring to the partnership, enough that you know who you are, what you value, what you're here to do, enough that relationship enhances your journey rather than replacing it. Danger 4. Generational trauma transmission. Now we move from individual to systemic destruction, because unhealed people don't just damage themselves, they damage everyone in their relational field, particularly children. Jung understood trauma as unconscious material that gets passed between generations. A parent with unresolved wounds unconsciously recreates those wounds in their children, not through conscious choice, but through the invisible transmission of unprocessed psychic content. Here's a common sequence. A woman with an unhealed father complex enters relationship prematurely, seeking in her husband what she never received from father. When she has children, especially a son, she unconsciously uses him to meet the needs her husband can't fulfill. The boy becomes emotional spouse, confidant, the man of the house. This creates a mother complex in the son, an unhealthy psychological fusion with the mother. He grows up unable to separate, seeking mother in every woman he meets, incapable of healthy sexual relationships. He might enter premature relationship to escape mother's hold, only to replicate the dynamic with his partner. And when he has children, he transmits his unresolved complex to them. One person's failure to individuate creates a cascade effect across generations. Jung saw this as one of the primary mechanisms of collective neurosis: wounded people creating wounded relationships that produce wounded children who grow into wounded adults who create more wounded relationships. The most insidious part is that it's invisible. Parents believe they're loving their children while unconsciously using them to meet their own unmet needs. Partners believe they're building a life together while actually recreating their family of origin dynamics. Everyone has good intentions while participating in the transmission of psychological wounding across time. Jung described families as unconscious systems, where everyone plays assigned roles in unspoken dramas: the identified patient, the scapegoat, the golden child, the caretaker. These roles aren't chosen, they're assigned unconsciously, based on the family system's need to maintain homeostasis and avoid confronting its core wounds. Children raised in these systems absorb the unspoken rules. Don't talk about father's drinking. Don't acknowledge mother's depression. Don't express needs that might burden the parents. Don't be too successful, it would shame father. Don't be too independent, it would threaten mother. They learn to contort themselves to serve the system's defensive needs, and they bring this training into their adult relationships, recreating the same dynamics, passing the same wounds to their own children, perpetuating cycles that can continue for generations until someone becomes conscious enough to break them. This is why Jung insisted that individuation isn't selfish, it's the most generous thing you can do. By healing yourself, by becoming conscious, by completing your psychological development before having children, you break the transmission cycle. You become the generation that stops passing wounds forward. You create a healed lineage. Danger 5. Soul loss. Now we arrive at Jung's most dire warning, the darkest consequence of premature love: soul loss. This is a concept Jung borrowed from shamanic traditions but reframed psychologically. In shamanic understanding, severe trauma can cause parts of the soul to fragment and depart, requiring ritual retrieval. Jung saw the psychological equivalent: premature love can lead to such profound self-abandonment that you lose connection to your own self, your authentic being, your destiny. Here's how it happens. You enter relationship before you've discovered who you truly are. You abandon your authentic path to accommodate the relationship. You suppress your real desires, your creative calling, your deepest purpose. You tell yourself it's compromise, but actually it's self-betrayal. Years pass. You've built a life, but it's not your life. It's a life designed around relationship maintenance, around being a good partner, around not rocking the boat. The person you were meant to become has been sacrificed for the person you needed to be to make the relationship work. And one day you wake up with a horrifying realization: you've lost yourself. Not in the romantic sense of being consumed by love, but in the existential sense of having no idea who you are or what you're here to do. You've spent so long being someone's partner that you've forgotten to be yourself. Jung called this soul loss because it involves disconnection from the self, that central organizing principle that knows your unique purpose, your authentic path, your destiny. When you lose connection to self, you lose connection to meaning. Life becomes empty performance, going through motions, experiencing a subtle but pervasive sense of deadness. I've watched this destroy people. A woman who abandoned her artistic calling to support her husband's career, waking up at 60 realizing she never created any of the work she was born to create. A man who suppressed his spiritual seeking to maintain a marriage with someone who mocked his woo-woo interests, reaching his 70s with deep regret about the path he never walked. The tragedy is that recovery from soul loss can take decades. You must first recognize what you've lost, which requires admitting you made a catastrophic mistake. Then you must begin the painful work of reclamation, often requiring relationship dissolution or radical restructuring, creating havoc for everyone involved. Then you must actually walk the path you abandoned. But now you're older, opportunities have passed, time is limited. Some people never recover. They live their entire lives having betrayed their authentic calling for the security of relationship. They die having never become who they were meant to be. Jung considered this the ultimate human tragedy, not physical death, but existential death, soul death, dying while still alive. The prevention requires fierce commitment to self. Before entering relationship, you must know your path. You must have touched your authentic purpose. You must have established connection to yourself, that inner voice that knows your truth even when everyone around you contradicts it.